I'd like to welcome you to the great population debate. So today, to look at some of the issues, we have Roger Martin, who is the chairman of the Optimum Population Trust. Roger's previously worked in the diplomatic service. We also have Brendan O'Neill, who will be known to many of you as the editor of Spiked and the author of Can I Recycle My Granny? And 39 other eco-dilemmas.
This is an emotive topic, and so it's always good to start with some facts. And to me, the most important fact is that planet Earth is finite. And that means that it can't sustain indefinite growth in anything physical, including number of people, and therefore we know for a fact that global population growth will definitely stop at some point. And when it does, it'll be in one of two ways, or a combination. It'll either be sooner by fewer births, or later by more deaths. And that means either by the humane way, contraception backed by policy to make it available and encourage people to use it, or nature's way, that is famine, disease, and predation or war. There is no third alternative of indefinite growth. Since I left Somerset this morning to come here, I'm sharing the planet with 50,000 more people. And these are all different, and they are all human beings, and they all have rights and a due respect, and they all have talents, but they all have certain common basic physical needs together, and that is notably food, water, and energy. Last year, the government chief scientist John Beddington and the president of the Royal Society, Lord Rees, both made separate speeches referring to the perfect storm approaching our society in this century, and both picking out overpopulation, climate change, and peak oil, leading to shortages of, yes, food, water, and energy. Now, I could produce for you 100 boring statistics about the numbers, the rate at which, the detail of which we are degrading our planet, munching through the life support system that we inherited in terms of pollution and so on. I'll only quote one, and it's related to food. In 1960, there was about half a hectare per person in the world of arable cropland. Useful stuff, and that would be enough to maintain a modest European standard of nutrition. That figure is now 0.2 of a hectare, and in China it's 0.1. And the reason is, of course, primarily that the population has doubled in that time. It's also that the consumption per head has gone up. We're putting more strain on it, and it's also that we're degrading that soil at accelerating rates, and notably in China. Now, from this, the arithmetic you can derive is not difficult. It's kind of primary school stuff. The total impact on the planet of people equals the average impact per person times the number of people. That's a fact, not an opinion. Arithmetic definition. And therefore, every additional person ratchets up the impact and ratchets down everybody else's share of a finite planet's resources. And forgive the primary school illusions, but it is a bit like a pie. We can all get the idea that if you have a pie, you're two of you, you get half each, four of you, quarter each, and so on. The more there are, the smaller slice each person has. That's why Kofi Annan said last year, as a key recommendation of a Geneva conference that I spoke at and had a good talk with him at, he said, population stabilization should be a priority for sustainable development, and contraction and convergence with a population base year should be the basis for climate justice. And this is very like a point that our patron David Attenborough says regularly. He says, every environmental problem would be easier to solve with fewer people and ultimately impossible with ever-increasing numbers. Now, for saying these things, we get a lot of wonderful arguments, of course, against us, and we get called some wonderful names. And my favourite one is this. The odious OPT is a zombie-like Malthusian organisation devoted to the cause of human depletion. That was by one Frank Furedi. Any relation to that?
Married soon.
Another patron, Jonathan Porritt, gets regular hate mail from Redneck Somewhere. When you start the cull, start with yourself. Funny, can't tell people who do exist and have rights from those who don't and don't. One of Brendan's is, everyone is born with a brain and a pair of hands. Well, that's quite true, but they also, unfortunately, have this shared need for food, water, and energy. Another one Brendan came up with the other day, it's very picturesque, is blackmail. You're holding a gun to the head of the planet and you're saying, stop breeding or the planet gets it. It's good picturesque stuff. But of course, it's no more blackmail than health warnings on a packet of cigarettes. Or indeed, the smoking kills on my cigarettes is a death threat. That's much even more serious. There's the Catholic various arcane arguments, which I won't go into, but I can do a fine rant on the evil of Catholic contraception doctrine. But I'll spare you it because there's no time. A good point made, a sound criticism made, is that Malthus and Paul Ehrlich, another patron of mine, forecast numbers with dates in looking at a grim future. And those dates and numbers turned out to be wrong. Quite true, I have learnt the lesson from their mistake, and I never forecast numbers and dates. I may project them, but otherwise just look at, as it were, the trend of the science and the logic. Then there's the Manichaean view that it's not, it's either or. It's not population, it's consumption or distribution or technology or wealth or poverty or meat eating. Of course, some people can't grasp the idea that it could be population and all those things, the multiplier of the impacts of all those things. Then there's technology will save us. But of course, faith in a benign technology yet to exist is identical to faith in salvation by God, in that it can't be disproved, but there's no evidence for it. Coercion we get a lot. You want to drag poor women screaming to the sterilization table just like China. Funny how there are 67 countries in the world with population policies. Only one of them is coercive, that's China's, and that's the one they always mention. I'd rather be like Thailand, who achieved the same reductions in fertility without coercion. Then we hate a lot of people, us people in OPT. I made a list over the last couple of years of all the things we've been accused of hating. We hate people. We hate life, family, women, children, immigrants, fun, freedom, God, the third world, black people, rich people, and poor people. We hate them all. Well, it's all good knockabout stuff, of course, but it's not serious, is it? There are two conflicting arguments from more serious sources than these, and they are from the government. When I try to urge them to introduce population into the climate talks, they say it's too late for that. It takes too long for population stabilization policies to work. The crisis is upon us. It's more urgent. On the other side, and of course implies that we should have done it 3 decades ago, that we are right, but it's too late. Secondly, though, you get Fred Pearce, I believe environmental editor of The Guardian designate, who takes the completely opposite view. Relax, don't worry about population, not a problem, don't talk about it. It'll all come right, it's solving itself. Well, actually, Fred, no, it's not solving itself, not without energy, effort, and resources to help it to happen. Best argument of all is one that Brendan used the first time we did this double act at the Wellcome Trust about a year ago. He said, more people are more solutions, not more problems. And I pointed out that that meant if we had 7 trillion people, we'd be 1,000 times better off than if we merely had 7 billion. And he said, yes, I can see many ways in which a planet with 7 trillion could be much better than it is now. One has to admire people with the courage of their convictions. What he proved to me then was that anything is indeed possible if you ignore the laws of physics. Now let's talk about the morality of it. There's one thing everyone in this room, I suspect, agrees with, and that is that coercion in this field is wrong. Chinese coercion is wrong. At the same time, the UN point out, about 40% of pregnancies worldwide are unintended, and pregnancy is a dangerous condition. People dying of pregnancy equate roughly to 4 jumbo jets full of pregnant women crashing every day. And there, out in the poor countries especially, there is unmet need for family planning by 220 million women lacking access to family planning, and therefore suffering not only coercive sex from their men, but coercive pregnancy, childbirth, and damage to their health. I regard that as scandalous. It would cost so little and be so easy to meet this huge unmet need, which is growing. That's what we should be angry about, the coercion there. But why is the need unmet? Well, because it has low priority. And why is that? Because of the mad taboo invented in the late 70s by a bizarre coalition of the religious right, led by the Pope, of course, the liberal left, who thought it was racist to mention population, and some elements of the feminist movement, who at the time had a case, but it's no longer true. So this taboo, which would, if breaking which, would enable us to add the massively powerful factual population growth argument to the existing, perfectly justifiable claim for more resources for family planning for poor women, on the basis that it's their right to have it, a good argument but a limited one. It would be very powerful and get very high priority if the movement would use the population case. And they won't, because of the taboo. Now, in developed countries like ours, a different criterion applies in moral terms, I think, because it's a fact and not an opinion that if two people choose to have a third child, they will, in fact, ratchet up the population of the planet, ratchet up environmental impact, bring nearer the day of serious environmental failure, which we can all see approaching somewhere on the horizon, and ratchet down everyone's share of resources to handle that. So they'll adversely affect everybody else in these three ways, and that introduces a moral element to their decision, and we'd ask them to think about it before taking that decision. So what can we do about it? I suggest three things. We can all, break the taboo whenever possible and state the fact that population growth is a key driver of every environmental problem, and therefore stable populations are essential to long-term sustainability, and the sooner the better, because a stable population will have a less damaged planet and more of it each, as Kofi Annan said. Secondly, in developed countries, lobby for, and especially the development NGOs lobby for, high priority for meeting the unmet need for good quality sexual and reproductive health care, and in particular for the accompanying programs to educate and empower women to take control of their own fertility. Women are the key here. They are left holding the baby, and they need our help, but they're not getting it. Thirdly, in rich countries like ours, work for a culture shift. There should be no coercion, so it means we've got to shift attitudes. And we need, therefore, to educate people about the implications of large families in order to get a better balance between individual reproductive rights and social and environmental responsibilities. Now, in conclusion, I frankly regret that we're still at the stage here of debating whether population is a problem, because it obviously is. And I don't understand, honestly. I've never really understood why Spiked and Anne's husband and previously this Institute of Ideas devoted so much effort to such passionate denunciation of us for stating these facts and holding these views. It's harming the prospects of my little granddaughter, not me, of course, but her, of a decent life when she's my age. And I wish they'd stop it. Because we could have spent the time on something much more interesting and relevant and difficult, and that is not whether it's a problem, but how to solve it, and particularly how to get that culture shift, how to raise awareness. But we can't do that while this loud, balmy, damaging denial persists. Thank you.
The main Malthusian idea I want to challenge today is the idea that resources are finite. The idea that the Earth itself is finite. The idea, as we've just heard, that we live on this finite planet and therefore we can only have a certain number of people living in a certain number of homes, eating a certain amount of food. Because it seems to me that the population control lobby's obsession with finiteness really exposes what they are all about. It really helps to reveal the historical illiteracy and the social pessimism that underpins the pseudo-scientific movement of Malthusianism. The Malthusian focus on finiteness explains firstly why they are always wrong about everything. Secondly, why they are so misanthropic. And thirdly, why they put forward such illiberal proposals, dressed up, of course, in the language of female empowerment. On the first point, Malthusians are simply wrong to say that resources are fixed, that we can measure and predict when they will run out. It seems commonsensical to say that the Earth is finite, and possibly a bit mad to say that it isn't. But it's important to recognise how fluid and changeable resources are. It's important to recognise that the usefulness and longevity of a resource is determined as much by us, by the level of social development we have reached, as it is by the existence of that resource in the first place. Resources are not fixed in any meaningful sense. Resources have a history and a future, just like human beings do. The question of what we consider to be a resource changes as society changes. So, in ancient Rome, for example, one of the main uses of coal was to make jewellery. Women liked the look of this glinting black rock hanging around their necks. No one could have imagined that thousands of years later, coal would be used to power massive steam engines and an entire industrial revolution, forever changing how we produce things and transport them around the world. 2,000 years ago, the only way people used uranium was to make glass look more yellow. It was used to decorate windows and to decorate mirrors. You would probably have been locked up or subjected to an exorcism if you had suggested that one day uranium might be used to light up and heat entire cities, or indeed destroy entire cities at the push of a button. So the exact same resource can do very, very different things depending on social and technological development. It was social limits, not physical limits, which meant that ancient Romans couldn't use coal to make things move, and other ancient communities could only use uranium to make glass look more yellow. And the main problem with resource pessimists, such as Malthusians, is that they continually mistake social limits for physical limits. They naturalize social limits, reinterpreting and representing problems of social development as problems of nature's shrinking bounty. They make the fatal flaw of arguing that the main barrier to progress and human comfort is the barrier erected by nature's limited resources, when in fact it is the barrier erected by the crisis of social imagination. That is why they are wrong about absolutely everything, why every prediction made by every population scaremonger through history has failed to materialize. A very early population panicker was the 2nd century Christian philosopher Tertullian. In 200 AD, Tertullian said, "We are burdensome to the world. The resources are scarcely adequate for us. Already nature does not sustain us." But back then, there were only 180 million human beings on the entire planet, about the same number that now lives in the eastern part of the United States. The problem for Tertullian was his understandably limited imagination. In his time, pretty much the only known resources were animals, plants, and various metals and minerals. He had no way of conceiving of the enormous abundance of resources inside the earth, which lay dormant because of social limitations, not natural ones. Thomas Malthus himself, the messiah of modern-day Malthusianism, argued in the early 1800s that food production wouldn't be able to keep a pace with human reproduction, and as a result there would be epidemics, pestilence and plagues that would sweep off millions of people. Yet in Malthus's era there were only 980 million people on Earth. Today there are more than that in China alone, and they all have food to eat. Malthus's problem was that he also saw natural limits where in fact there were social limits. His fundamental pessimism meant that he considered it impossible for mankind to develop beyond a certain nature-enforced point. And yet, after he made his population pronouncements, through the Industrial Revolution and various social revolutions, mankind did overcome many of his social limitations and found new ways to make food and to deliver it to the masses around the world. It is their finite-obsessed outlook which means that Malthusians are spectacularly wrong all the time. You would literally be better off listening to Mystic Meg than you would to the OPT. Malthusians pose as a science-based rationalist movement that has worked out through equations and pie charts what the carrying capacity of the Earth is, but actually, going back to the primary school illusion, they continually make a schoolboy scientific error. Their error is to imagine that population is the only variable, the only thing that grows and grows, while everything else including resources, society, progress and discovery, stays roughly the same. But the truth, as history shows, is that population is not the only variable. Resources are also a variable. So is mankind's vision, his ability to rethink and tackle problems. These things grow and change just as population does. And Malthusian mathematics doesn't add up because their social pessimism means that they fail to factor in probably the most important and decisive variable of all, which is mankind's ingenuity. And it seems very clear to me that despite everything Roger says, the problems we face today still are absolutely social rather than natural. We now live under a cult of sustainability, a social and political framework which says that we should never overhaul what exists and instead should make do with it as best we can. And this idea of sustainability is anti-exploration, anti-experimentation, anti-risk, all the qualities we need if we are going to make the kind of breakthroughs that earlier generations made with coal and uranium and everything else. In contrast to the past, today, unfortunately, human society is accommodating to social limitations and accepting the idea that they are natural rather than trying to break through them. Malthusianism is not a taboo. The Malthusian mindset is winning, and that, I think, is a tragedy for all of us. The second important thing about the Malthusians' concern with finiteness is that it helps to explain why they are so misanthropic. Over the past 200 years, Malthusians have tended to look at people as simply the users up of scarce resources. They have tended to view nature as the producer of things and mankind as the consumer of things. And this view of people as consumers, almost as parasites, inevitably leads them to seeing human beings as the cause of every modern social ill, and therefore reducing the number of human beings as the real solution to every modern ill. Their focus on finiteness means that they conceive of humanity as a kind of bovine force hoovering up everything that it comes across. And the ascendancy of the Malthusian outlook can really be seen in the way that people are frequently discussed these days as consumers, exploiters, the users of resources, the destroyers of their surroundings. So, more and more, mankind's building of cities and factories is referred to as an eco-footprint, as if it is something dirty and destructive that should be cleaned away. Our use of natural resources such as wood and oil is referred to as the rape of the planet. Even our use of water is now problematized, with various charities telling us to measure our water footprint and only to shower every other day. We're now encouraged to be water neutral. And in the past, there was another word for water neutrality. It was death. There is no living creature known to man that can survive without water, and yet today we're supposed to feel guilty about using it. And I think this popular depiction of mankind as gorging on nature's fragile resources is not actually based on scientific fact or hard proof of widespread resource depletion. That is clear from the fact that even water is now included in the list of resources that we should feel guilty about using. Only a mad person could believe that water will ever run out. No, this view is based on a profound philosophical shift in our attitudes towards ourselves. A shift from viewing humanity as the tamer of the planet and the creator of society towards viewing humanity as a plague on the planet and the destroyer of our surroundings. And it's a spectacularly one-sided view of people because we don't just use resources, we also create them. We are not just consumers, we are also producers. In fact, I would argue that we have realized the potential of this planet. Without humans, it would just be another ball spinning through space, full of useless coal and pointless uranium. But we have extracted that coal and uranium and made something amazing with it, modern human society. We created the social conditions in which the Earth's resources could be used to their full potential. We created the means for extracting and transforming those resources. We created cities, workplaces, and homes on the back of those resources. And every time we managed to get more and more stuff from fewer resources and created new resources along the way. And I think the Malthusian view of humans as little more than consumers really leads to some very dodgy ideas on their part. So last year, the OPT launched a website called Pop Offsets, which involved encouraging well-off Westerners to offset their carbon emissions by paying for people in the third world to stop procreating. The idea is that you log on, enter information about a flight you recently took or how much you've been driving your car, and then the site tells you how much carbon you have used and therefore how much you should donate to a third world reproductive charity. That charity makes up for your carbon use by cutting back on the pitter-patter of tiny carbon footprints in countries like Kenya. So if you took a round trip from London to Sydney, that adds up to 10 tonnes of carbon, in which case you're asked to donate £40 to help prevent the birth of one child in Africa. That is the value that modern-day Malthusians put on human life. It is roughly equal to 10 tonnes of carbon, or one holiday in Australia. Apparently these lives have no intrinsic worth, no moral or cultural meaning. They're simply bargaining chips in some wealthy Westerner's desire to absolve himself of eco-guilt. And such misanthropy is a direct result of the kind of cult of finiteness. Because when you view human beings as the ravenous users of resources, then you start to see human life itself as a pollutant, as a drain on the planet. That is why Malthusians constantly refer to every newborn child in Africa as another mouth to feed. In their worldview, another child is not simply something to celebrate. It is simply an eating machine that needs to be attended to. And to re-quote myself, courtesy of Roger, we are actually more than mouths to feed. We have lost sight of the fact that human beings are also brains that can think, minds that can create, and hands that can work. And thirdly and finally, the elevation of the Malthusian idea of finiteness gives rise to authoritarianism. Because when you see everything as running out, when you believe that anarchy is just around the corner, then you become a bit like those crazy men in Alabama who think the world is coming to an end, so they stock up on guns and baked beans and never leave the house. You develop a siege mentality. You see other human beings as a kind of tsunami of destruction, and almost any measure can be justified to hold that tsunami back. But of course, the Malthusians have learned from their past. They have learned from their earlier dalliances with eugenics in the 1930s and forced sterilization in India in the 1970s, and from their complicity in the development of China's one-child policy in the 1980s. They know from those experiences that population authoritarianism is not popular. Women don't like to be told what to do with their wombs. Men don't like being forced into vasectomies. So modern-day Malthusians have adopted the language of reproductive choice and female empowerment. But this is really, really disingenuous. Because when you promote family planning on the basis that too many children will destroy the planet, on the basis that women are creating future pollutants, on the basis that our offspring will turn into planet rapists, then you are not giving women choice. You are giving them an ultimatum. You are telling them that their individual behaviour is destructive, and if they carry on, the world will come to an end. That is coercion. That is an interference with people's free will. And it is the end result of a misanthropic outlook which says that the worst thing a human being can do is create another human being.
The problem for me is that you're not that representative of the population movement I worry about. It's the fact that Jonathan Porritt, former schoolmate of Prince Charles, government advisor on sustainable development, is on your board, that Sir David Attenborough, actually a person who many young people here enjoyed and respect greatly over the years, is also a member of your organisation. And more importantly, that the Royal Society this year has launched a population project to investigate these issues which your organisation are party to. That strikes me as far more significant and something that the people in this room ought to be concerned about rather than you. And I was just wondering whether Brendan might comment on the more important mainstreaming of these issues rather than the people who believe that if they were on their own on this world, they would have the whole pie to themselves.
Surely the reason why the Optimum Population Trust's case is so weak is that it assumes, even if we grant the idea that there are too many people in the world, which I don't and we ought not to, that the reason why there are too many people is there has been this terrible amount of fertility going on, and if we just restrict the amount of fertility, this will lead to fewer human beings and less of a problem. It's just like this kind of chart you've given us here, this kind of kind of idea that in the 1950s and 60s, all these people got born, oh, terrible. The problem with that, of course, being that total fertility rates have declined over the last 50 years. They haven't increased. The reason why there are more people in the world is not because, in the words of one UN population specialist, I can't remember his name, but he said that the problem is not that people started breeding like rabbits, they stopped dying like flies. The reason is there is better healthcare, there is better economic progress, this is increasing more and more and more. And in fact, that's the very thing that will eventually lead to fewer people being born, in a sense. If you really want to decrease fertility rates, have greater economic growth that will lead to people, to urbanization, people going to cities, having fewer children, as opposed to agrarian economies, where they have more children because they need more children to go out on the farm. So your case, attacking fertility rate, apart from the fact it's completely futile, is completely pointless. There is no reason to do that.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I'm very struck by Brendan's faith in salvation by techno-fix. Like I said, faith and salvation by God, I can't disprove it, but there's no evidence for it. I forgot in my own talk, actually, to mention what we do stand for, apart from wanting to stabilise numbers. We stand for the optimum quality of life, not quantity of humans, in a sustainable society where the optimal number of people can be sustained in an environmentally long-lasting way. And frankly, the fact that the number of people correlates inversely with the quality of life after you have reached some optimal point and gone past it is the missing point. I think, frankly, anybody with a small flat, no matter even if they're Brendan, with this limitless creativity and ability to conjure space out of just the imagination, even he, if he had a small flat and wanted to give a good party, he'd probably invite guests in the low dozens rather than the low thousands. I think it's pretty clear to most people that you can have too many people, and he needs a bigger flat. Fine, we haven't got a bigger planet. The fact that all the scientists are on my side, of course, the fact that these are, is not altogether to discount us, in that I suspect most of you rely on science for really quite a lot of your quality of life. So I leave you with that thought.
The space issue is just a complete red herring. I mean, you go to somewhere like Australia, there's no one there. You could have billions and billions of people in Australia alone. So the space thing is just, it doesn't work. I think on the question of, do I just want technological fixes? Do I have my faith just in technology, like some kind of weird robot? No, the thing I talked about was social development and social optimism and social imagination, from which technology springs. But the thing I'm talking about, the thing that transforms society, is social development, social progress. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what we need more of today. It's not just a techno fix. And I really agree that with one of the commenters who said that the idea that the planet is overpopulated is not a taboo. It's completely mainstream now. You can't open the Daily Telegraph these days without some interview with a celebrity saying that the planet is overrun with too many people, whether it's Chris Packham from That Really Wild Show thing, or Joanna Lumley, or David Attenborough, or anyone else. And then you open The Guardian recently, and they had a piece by a feminist defending China's one-child policy on the basis that it's helped to reduce the world's population by 400 million people, and that's a good thing, which is something she actually got from Jonathan Porritt, who has also openly defended China's one-child policy for helping to reduce the number of Chinese people on the planet. A feminist defending a policy which tells women how many children they can have and how they ought to have sex and everything else. Everywhere you look these days, the Malthusian mindset, the idea that people are just users of resources and that there are too many of us, is everywhere. It's in environmentalism, it's in the media, it's in extreme groups like the OPT, and it's in more moderate-seeming groups as well. And so the idea that you're a taboo buster, it just doesn't add up.
Your speech actually tried to make me feel guilty for being alive and for living, or for even thinking and considering of having a family when I'm older and all the implications that might come of that. And what actually struck me is when you mentioned your granddaughter and basically the future generations and what might happen to them if people in Africa don't stop producing children. And that just hit me, because instead of thinking about making them stop having children, we should be thinking of the ways we can improve the quality of their life and be able to allow them to sustain their families and have better lives for them and better lives for the future generations. And if we can improve their quality of life, then with quality of life comes better life expectancy, and with life expectancy, longer life expectancy brings around more people and a greater population.
I just want to unpick this idea that we only live on one planet, which does sound very commonsensical. And it's often quoted, people say we only have one planet, but we use the resources of 1.5 planets. And that's a fact. Well, it's not a fact. It's based on a model. I've been reading recently the Living Planet Report 2010, which is by the WWF, formerly the World Wildlife Fund, along with the Global Footprint Network and the Zoological Society of London. And this is where this one planet idea comes from. And it's not a fact. It's based on a model. And even if you agree with the Malthusians, you can't say, yes, it's a fact. You have to look at the model, the assumptions behind the model, and see if it's right. And what it does is it looks at factors like biodiversity, water, carbon, and so on. It has various indices in relation to each of those factors. It combines the indices, say in relation to biodiversity, and creates what's called a mashup index. It mashes them together. And then it mashes all of the sub-indices together, so water, carbon, biodiversity. And the conclusion it comes to is what's called a mashup of mashups. In other words, it's a model based on particular assumptions. You have to ask whether those assumptions are right or not. It's not a question of fact or not fact. You have to look at the assumptions. As it happens, by their own admission, what really drives their 1.5 planet figure is carbon and carbon dioxide. That's not my reading of it. That's what they say in their report. And I would say that that's a complete misreading, again, of this idea of a natural limit, when in fact it's a social limit. Because in relation to the amount of carbon dioxide we pump into the atmosphere, and I'm open to the idea that we pump in too much to the atmosphere, but there are all sorts of solutions to that, such as having more nuclear power stations, using hydroelectric power, using solar power, using modern sea defences to increase our sea level, lots of technological solutions. So it is not a fact, with respect. It's an assumption based on particular values, based on a particular model, and whether you agree with the Malthusians or not, you have to interrogate that model. It is not a fact.
Each one of you, I hope to hell we have techno fixes that can reduce carbon dioxide emission. That's absolutely critical. Part of the solution may be over the next century that we have to worry about population. I don't know. I would not rule it out. We have to do things which I believe are critical to save our climate. We could be in absolute meltdown. We don't know. So we have to prepare for ourselves. Techno fixes and maybe population growth might be part of the mix. I don't know. For sure, I think it has to drive the agenda.
Well, I used to work several years for Sweden with development cooperation in Africa and Asia. Sweden, as you may know, belongs to those countries who are almost living up to the 1% goal of the United Nations. It was based on parliamentary decisions in the early 60s. These parliamentary decisions had family planning in a good health environment as one of its main points. Consequently, Swedish development assistance in the 60s and 70s had some very good and very successful focus on such programs, both in Africa and in Asia. Thomas Malthus was not an unknown concept in the 60s, but I don't think anybody at that time would have accused Swedish aid workers for being Malthusians. On top of this, 1974, the first United Nations population conference took place. There was a rather strong majority in the United Nations at the time for a good, well-integrated, health-oriented family planning program. There were resistance, if I remember correctly, from the Vatican and Saudi Arabia. 10 years later, the second population conference took place in 1984. The opposition had then grown to encompass some other Catholic countries, some other Muslim countries, plus Ronald Reagan's USA and the growing evangelical movement in the United States. In 1994, the lobbies against population, for reasons that I'm not familiar with, have grown so strong that it became something very little came out of that conference. And after 1994, the issue in the United Nations is more or less dead. I allow myself to wonder why this happened and what should be so evil about having a decent discussion about this. And I welcome that the Battle of Ideas have this discussion.
Mr. Roger, I think it's a little rich for you to compare those like Brendan or myself, the big potatoes group in favor of technological innovation, or what you ridicule as technical fixes. It's a bit rich for you to say that to be into that is akin to sort of the Christian faith in salvation. There's no evidence that it works. You yourself would not be talking here were it not for the lights, the microphone, and as you point out yourself, our dependence on science. So your cynicism about technological development, I find very objectionable. And I think it does disparage ingenuity. It does suggest also that you know nothing of the laws of physics that you invoke. You will be familiar with the fact that the solar energy incident on the world every day is to all intents and purposes infinite. If you talk to Jonathan Porritt, your board member, you will find that during his time at the Sustainable Development Commission, at no time did he favour any more research or innovation in solar power or any of these other things. Leave aside nuclear power. So what we find is that, you know, your disdain for technology, your comparison with religion, is something that is continued with your board members in their refusal to put forward a program that can deliver energy so that we can have more children, more consumption, and a more human world. And your ignorance of that law of physics and your board members' refusal to see human beings as anything else as consumers makes it all the more disreputable for you to come here and say that human beings are the menace that you make them out to be. I find it quite abhorrent, and I find it from a British diplomat only too typical that you know nothing of physics and that you continue to push forward these views in the way that you do.
I don't know how long you've spent in Africa and Asia. I've spent 8 years, and 4 at the UN. I would like just to tell you a little story to illustrate that point. When I arrived in Vietnam as a very young diplomat, I inherited a house with a cook who just had her 4th child. I said, very nice baby, Ti, how many more do you want? I don't want any more, but I don't know how to stop. Very easy, you take this $20 bill and this note to this address, they'll fix you up with a coil. She came back, she loved me like a son from that moment onward. Far more than she owed to me as an employer, but she said, don't tell my husband. And when I told that story later to Zimbabwean peasants, farmers in their straw rondavel with a large family around the table, when I mentioned to the shh bit, then my host thumped the table, leapt to his feet and shouted, that's a wicked woman. Now, I don't know how much experience you've had of real women desperate to control their own fertility all over the poorest parts of the world, but I've met plenty, and I really sympathise with them. I want to give them control over their fertility, and not, as my cook, Ti, said, be forced into endless, repetitive childbearing.
Well, the thing to me is it doesn't even seem to matter whether the numbers of people actually rise or fall eventually due to whatever different factors. But the point is, you don't have a kind of positive progress kind of agenda.
I've done a bit of primary school mathematics myself, and the UN says there's going to be 2 billion additional people over the next 10 years on the planet, 2 billion. Well, I've worked that out, that we need to, if they are to be sheltered, they are to have a home, we need to build 1 home every second, right? Now, the problem, I'm a town planner, and I really want to build, right? Now, every time I raise the spectre that we need new towns, we need to build not just in this country, but elsewhere, it's similar to the family planning argument, you know, it's choice, people, it's a need. I'm shouted down by people who say, look, Tony, we haven't got time for that. The planet is about to go. We haven't got time to discuss people's housing needs. And that's the problem, that organisations like yourself are distracting people from what's really needed.
No one can disagree that women want to have a choice on how many children they have, but you seem to make an illogical leap that they must have 2 or less. And that surely is not the point.
Not must.
There does seem to be a very unhealthy obsession, not just from the Optimum Population Trust, but from a lot of NGOs, with people's sexual behaviour in the developing world. You know, it's a sort of third world porn to rich Westerners to worry about who they're screwing and how many babies they're having. And in truth, of course, there is really inadequate health provision across the developing world, and I've spent a lot of time, particularly in West Africa, But there is also really inadequate, in fact no, infertility treatment. Not one NGO is addressing the very real problem of infertility in the developing world, which is also a major concern for women there, because they're not weird or a different species. And finally, women are not out on the streets demanding condoms. That condoms in most places are one of the easiest things to get hold of. It's just not adequate. And neither are most African men rapists, and women do not live in rape camps having babies against their choice.
Well, I'm a great supporter of reproductive choice, and Spike is a very pro-choice publication, but we're not talking about choice when we're talking about the NGOs that are swarming around Africa, handing out condoms left, right and centre, lecturing women about their husbands' coercive sexual advances, as Roger described them. That's not choice. It is a form of coercion, because when you pollute people's reproductive choices with ideas about eco-apocalypse, when you introduce your own external concerns, your own prejudices into their choice-making lives, then you are changing it. It's no longer a choice. And if these women chose to have 10 children, Roger and others in the OPT wouldn't say, that's fine, it's your choice. But choice does mean the choice to have no children, 2 children, or 10 children. And that is not what they're talking about.
As an old women's libber, I find it scarily objectionable that you can use the idea of women having the right to control her own fertility as an argument to control the population. I think what's happening here is two very different areas of debate being conflated. So I think every individual woman should have the right to choose. And I think that, anywhere in the world, women should have the right to choose. And that desire to control your life, not to be subject to the vagaries of nature, is a really important right to be able, it's really important to be able to exercise the right to have, to control your fertility, your nature, even as the last speaker said about, even being able to solve the problem of infertility. That right to overcome nature is a very important one. But that's not the same at all as controlling a population, as having policies about controlling a population, which I think I find myself very much agreeing with Brendan, that what comes across is a human-hating thing, whereas the desire to control your fertility is not human-hating, it's just trying to control your life.
I wanted to address the issue about fertility in Africa. My parents are from Nigeria, and Nigeria's population was 50 million in the 50s, now it's 150 million. So you can see a 100 million gap. The problem is not so much the increase in population, but the resources being given by the government. People would listen to what you were saying if you were coming from the approach that, oh, these women are suffering, we want to help them. But you're coming from the approach, we want to decrease the population. So let's look for holes where we could look for, let's look for a place where we can decrease the population, and then use that to gain what you want to gain. So your motives is not right. So that's why people don't see it as the right thing to do. And I just want to refer to the increase in population that you were referring to. Why do you lack ambition? Why do you lack the aspiration to grow? There's no aspiration to look at increasing resources to meet the demands. There is no aspiration whatsoever. So why don't you try and focus on that rather than decreasing the population?
I'd just like to briefly challenge this notion that has been raised before, that population is a taboo subject. And a point that was made at the front that the UN hasn't talked about it for a long time. I don't think it's 6 weeks since the last UN summit in New York on population and development, which was dressed up as a discussion about climate change, but where population was not only the subtext, but it was the supertext and the text and everything they spoke about. It is certainly not a taboo subject, and when I stand up at the Woodrow Wilson building not 2 months ago to challenge this idea that we need to start talking, we need to continue talking about population and move away from the consensus that emerged after the '94 Population and Development Conference, whereby at least a modicum of a woman-centered approach was adopted. I was laughed at. there's just absolutely no concept that anybody, there's no idea that anybody wants to talk about a woman-centered approach to this anymore. And they are obsessed with numbers and obsessed with population. It's got to the stage where if you're not providing services in the developing world, it is very, very difficult to get any funding for work you want to do there. We do a lot of work. I work at Catholics for Choice, and we do a lot of work in the developing world, especially Catholic countries, working with women, trying to liberalize contraception laws and overturn anti-abortion laws. But if you're not actually providing services, nobody is interested in talking to you. We've been refused funding on a number of occasions because we're not willing to put 3 little rods in women's arms and ensure that they can control their fertility to the manner in which men in Chicago and New York are interested in. I also, just very briefly, want to say that there may be 67 countries with population policies in the world, but I can guarantee you that I could look at every single one and find coercion prevalent in it. And Furedi mentioned the fact that in Singapore they want to have more children, the same in France, Italy, and Japan. And they're trying to find new ways, friendly ways of coercing people through tax breaks and other forms of friendly coercion. But you look at every single population growth policy, whether it's Peru, Guatemala, the Roma in Central Europe, there are elements of coercion to every single one. And that's why I think the only way that we can approach the issue of fertility is one, as the colleague before me said, where women are at the center of it and are given the options to choose whether to have children, how many to have, and when to have them.
I think there was a very selective view of what women in the third world want. Actually, some of them might want to limit their fertility, but at the same time, I think a lot of women in the third world would quite like a house. They wouldn't mind a flushing toilet. They'd certainly like enough food to feed their family, however big it is. So their aspirations, I should imagine, are quite a lot wider than you would suggest. Similarly, you know, the idea that the problem facing women in the third world is the fact that they have these husbands who are demanding of sex and who impregnate them, and that they'd love to be protected from this difficulty, again is perhaps a little bit of a selective view of people in the third world. What people need in the third world, right, is actually greater material equality. That's the problem that faces them, and that's the problem that faces women. They do face inequality on a wide number of different levels, but the thing that they really need above all else is material equality, and the precondition for that is that these countries can modernize, industrialize, and grow.
Well, I've got 2 children, and I'm very pleased to have the means to control my fertility. And I think it is what is a very important right that people have fought for and won in various parts of the world. But the point is, as other people have indicated, it's a question of where you start and why you start from there. And to me, the big shift is from the assumption that you start with the person, the people. You know, you look at society as a collection of people, and from there, what decisions you make and what you choose to do, to looking at people's reproductive decisions as being determined by something extrinsic to them. And in that respect, I think the current discussion about the need to limit population, stabilise population, control population, deal with the unmet need for contraception, whatever you call it, it's all the same discussion, is as problematic and very similar, actually, to previous historical discussions about pronatalism and the idea that women should have more children for the sake of society rather than for their own sake. So I think, really, in terms of reframing this discussion, we do need to get away from the numbers and the equations and resituate it back with the people who are making decisions and controlling both their own lives and the society that they're creating around that.
In response to the lady from Nigeria, where my daughter-in-law comes from, I was in Kampala last month and talking to the female minister about the problems of population growth there, which is very high, I showed a graph which merely indicated that they would grow, if they maintained the current fertility rate, current growth rate, they would grow in the next 100 years, one very old person's lifetime, from 33 million to 860 million people. And a Washington Research Institute had produced a map, a climate change map, suggesting putting Uganda in the top bracket, more than 400% increase in population in the next, by 2080, and more than 20% reduction in agricultural output. Now, putting these together, the minister was entirely clear and explicit that she wants help to get her population stabilized while they can still feed themselves. And the all-party parliamentary group produced a report 2.5 years ago on population and development, proving to me entirely satisfactorily that 37 out of the 41 least developed countries interviewed identified rapid population growth as the source of their poverty. It's a block in developing. As you can see, if you imagine you are the education minister in Niger on the one hand or China on the other, you get a real terms increase. The Chinese will be able to build 3 new universities and 10 more technical colleges because he doesn't have a huge cohort coming on. But in Niger, he will be able, with luck, to use his money to build enough new primary schools without trained teachers or books or chairs just to meet 1/3 of the swelling cohort coming in. And with that sort of situation, it is not easy for a country to develop. And they themselves believe that to be so. And I support them, rather than trying to tell them that their population growth rate is absolutely fine. And I come to Brendan and just ask again the finite planet thing. I liked his cult of sustainability, a whole new phrase to me. Let me just ask again, if ever more people are ever more creativity and ever more solutions, then what about not just a planet of 7 trillion, but how about 7 trillion, trillion? Will you admit any physical limits, whatever? Because if you do, we can talk the same language. Thank you.
I like the fact that Roger accuses me of having blind faith in technology, yet he travels around the world with his graphs and says that as if they're the Dead Sea Scrolls and they have the solution to every moral and social and political problem, which is completely bizarre. On the question of how many people can the Earth carry, I mean, it's not a serious question. People make decisions based on their circumstances. A farmer in France knows that he can only have 1 or 2 children. A woman in Africa might want to have 10 children because they're more likely to die in early life and she needs people to look after her when she's old. People make decisions on an individual basis, and what I'm arguing against is polluting that decision-making process with Western prejudices. That's the problem. I think what's very interesting for me is the way in which the language of Malthusianism has changed over the years. So in the 1920s and 30s, Malthusians were concerned with protecting the racial stock of the white Western empires. In the 1960s, they adopted the language of family planning, and today they talk about environmentalism. It's interesting because the fundamental idea that there are too many people stays the same, but the justification for it changes over time, because this is a prejudice in search of a political disguise. This is an underlying, already existing social pessimism that looks around for a justification. That's what's happening here. And, you know, the OPT still does talk about the problems in Africa and Asia and other places where people are apparently having too many children, but it's even worse than that now, because that is obviously an echo of their past. But today they also feel incapable of valuing life, even in the West, even in their own countries. So we often hear the OPT saying that the worst people in the world are these Americans who have too many children and they consume so much stuff. So just when you think Malthusianism couldn't stoop any lower, it has. Because now it doesn't only problematize the poor and the black, like it used to do in the past. It now problematizes all forms of human life, here, there, and everywhere. And we really need to challenge that backward, reactionary outlook.